There'll be an opportunity for questions later on at the end of the webinar, so you can use the Q&A panel to put any questions in, and we'll have a look at them towards the end. Everyone is muted, so you'll just be able to listen, so the only communication will be through the Q&A panel. But thanks very much, Martin, for joining me today. It's safe to say like I said, it's a pretty difficult time. Do you want to start us off by just talking about the types of challenges that you're facing at the moment?
Hi, Kirsty, and thanks very much, and thanks everybody for joining today. Yeah, local government has probably always been a challenging environment. I've spent a large part of my career in local government, but have worked in other sectors as well. And I think this is probably fair to say the most challenging period we've ever had. We've now had, a decade of at best flat cash, but generally budget cuts at a time when the pressures on us are ever increasing. So the budget challenges every year get more and more difficult. A lot of that because I think a long time ago we did the easy things. Mm-hmm. I think we are pretty efficient. And as I said, I've worked in the private sector, I've worked in other parts of the public sector, and I genuinely believe local authorities are one of the most efficient organisations. Not something that the public probably always believe in, or even maybe ourselves, but I do believe we are pretty efficient. We're pretty lean, and while we're all sitting, we think that we are quite siloed actually compared to other organisations. I think our silos are much more penetrable. But yeah, the financial challenges are massive.
And one of the things that you're facing is a level of uncertainty in terms of planning horizons. The Scottish Government did their spending review that was published a few months ago, and obviously in light of that, inflation, even in the last couple of weeks, we've heard that it's going to be even higher than anticipated. How do you deal with that kind of environment? You've set your budget, but you're facing pressures that even a couple of months ago you didn't expect. And what does that mean for you, and how do you manage those kind of planning horizons in terms of short-term settlements?
Yeah, obviously, the longer you can plan, the better. We have to plan on a medium-term basis, but we have to make lots of assumptions because we get one-year settlements. It's a long time since we've had more than a one-year settlement. To be fair to Scottish Government, publishing the resource spending review and trying to look ahead for 3 years is helpful. Maybe the results aren't quite as helpful, but I understand how difficult it is for them for 3-year budgeting or perhaps even longer to work. It has to be throughout the entire system. So we need to have UK Government doing longer term financial plans as well as Scottish Government to allow us to do it more accurately. I'll be slightly controversial here. I would rather have short-term funding that was better than long-term funding that was poorer.
Yeah,
probably isn't that controversial really, but we constantly push to get 3-year settlements or 5-year settlements. But actually, if the people making those settlements have to be really prudent because they don't know, mm-hmm. and therefore put really bad settlements out, then that's in a way more worrying. Certainly for our politicians in Glasgow, putting the bad news out there and getting the bad press, and then it's not as bad because there's money comes in at the last minute. That's very frustrating for them because they get the bad press for making the hard decisions, and then when they don't have to make it, they kind of don't get the credit back. So certainty is more important, I suppose, in my mind than long term. Although long term is really important. With regard to the kind of, I suppose, in-year changes, and certainly inflationary pressure is pretty significant just now. We've all got electricity and gas bills at home, so we know exactly what's happening. We are slightly protected from that because I think most authorities buy through Scottish procurement, and they forward buy a reasonably high percentage of utilities. So that softens it, but it just means it's coming down the line, and we are already seeing significant pressures. We are certainly managing that in-house for this year, but we're just working our financial forecast for next year to share with the politicians, and it's likely to be a pretty difficult position with quite significant cuts required yet again, as well as the kind of inflationary pressure from utilities. That inflationary pressure on utilities impacts in so many other areas. So it impacts on our school transport, it impacts on our food costs, it impacts across the board. We're also seeing quite significant capital pressures. And again, that we do take a much longer term view of that expenditure, but that's likely to result in slowing down or maybe even the cancellation of some projects. And we've all seen the pictures from our colleagues in Edinburgh this week with the impact of strikes, and a number of other places, including Glasgow. Those strikes started today. But again, that pressure on the pay bill going forward is probably our biggest single pressure, with about 2/3 of our total cost being staff costs. Yeah. So there's a kind of a bit of a vicious circle of cost pressures that are coming just now. So we have to all try to keep a clear head, try to work together, try to talk to each other. What are other people doing? And there is some strength in unity. And we also have to start to look at how we can work with other bodies and other partners. And again, that will be one of the key features of Public Finance Live next month.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to have a really interesting session with James Gray, the CFO of Police Scotland, and Jonathan Beresford, the CFO of Aberdeen City Council, who've been doing some joint working in terms of co-location in buildings. And I suppose that's one of the things, obviously Scottish Government is really keen in terms of that integration agenda with health and social care, but in local authorities and lots of other public sector bodies, there are far greater opportunities for joint working. And like you said, Martin, with years of austerity, a lot of the easy ways to make savings are long gone. And it's more this service transformation and working with partners is something that I can imagine you and other parts of the public sector are really considering now. Is that something Glasgow are looking into?
I don't think it's a new thing for local government. I think we've been looking to work with partners for a long time. It does feel a little bit as if some of the partners might be more willing at the moment, because actually that kind of burning platform is quite evidently there. But we've worked together with third sector and other public sector partners for a number of years. One example in Glasgow, the Kelvin Hall, which is, for those as old as me, will remember it as the home of the circus and the Modern Home Show. So it was a kind of precursor to the Scottish Events Campus and the Hydro and the Exhibition Centre. But that's been transformed a number of times, and in its most recent transformation, it was done in partnership with the University of Glasgow, who now deliver some of their programme from that building. They have office space there, they have lecture facilities within the building, but it's also home to the National Library of Scotland's Film Archive, which, if you get the chance to go and visit, is one of the most fascinating things to see. You can go and watch old movies in the Kelvin Hall privately. So those kind of partnership workings to bring a historic building really back into everyday use. And we wouldn't have been able to do that on our own. It was only with the partnership with National Libraries and with University of Glasgow that's worked. And actually there'll be a second and possibly a third phase of Kelvin Hall, and there's a number of other public and private sector partners that we are talking to with that in mind. So yeah, it's really important that we work together.
And that's really interesting. Obviously, I can understand that, especially in this post-pandemic environment where people now work from home in a way that they didn't before, that things like sharing estates makes a lot of sense when a lot of public sector bodies have large estates. And that brings me into the other thing I wanted to mention, which we'll also be covering at the conference in a few weeks' time. And that's the bit about the environmental and sustainability agenda. most councils now in the country have declared a climate emergency, and many have these net zero plans, with a lot aiming towards net zero by, say, 2030. And obviously Glasgow itself was the host city for COP last year, so there was a lot of attention brought to that. But you talked earlier about that issue with the cost of building projects, for example, and a lot of achieving net zero does relate to, I think there was a big piece of work done around COP26, wasn't there, about the Glasgow estate, the housing estate, and what would have to happen to retrofit those buildings and so on. So how do you think that organisations can still take that agenda forward when they're in such a difficult financial position? How do they balance that?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a really difficult challenge, and a real challenge, not just for local authorities, but for our entire society. It's not something we can ignore. We're all aware of the changing weather patterns that are coming. I don't think we can deny that climate change is happening. And we need to determine what the role of the local authority is within that. Glasgow's doing a number of things. So Glasgow, along with I think all of our other Scottish cities, are in the process of introducing low emission zones and the challenges that brings. But just looking at building up our kind of prospectus for projects in Glasgow that need to be funded, we're talking about somewhere in the region of £40 billion. And I know those in small think we probably have that in our capital programme. We don't.
Not quite.
That is massive. And that covers a number of areas. It covers transport, so the low emission zones. It covers our own fleet. And greening fleets are not an inexpensive business. An alternative fuels refuse collection vehicle is about 3 times the price of a diesel one. And diesel is obviously one of the biggest polluters. So these things all come at a challenge. But you'd mentioned that the kind of housing retrofit is one of the biggest areas that will make the biggest difference to Glasgow as a whole's position. And we've done some work. So Glasgow has a high percentage of tenemental properties. And the estimates are that the average cost will be about £40,000 per unit, wow. Not per tenemental building, per flat within that tenement. Now, on a good day, that might save £500 or £1,000 off people's utility bills. I understand that might be a figure that's increasing every day that goes on, but that £1,000 saving, even a £2,000 saving, doesn't really justify a £40,000 investment for that individual. So actually, we need to look at alternative ways of financing that kind of investment. We have done things in the past. Again, I'm sure most people on this call will be far too young, but not that long ago, throughout Scotland, we had issue with lead pipes, and we had lead pipe replacement programmes where significant grants were provided for people to replace their lead pipes. And again, in tenemental properties, we've got to get 6 or 8 residents or families to agree to that process. It's challenging, but we did it in the past, so we need to maybe look to the past to determine what we need to do in the future. And again, in Glasgow, we've appointed a green economy manager who, I'm sure he volunteered to speak at SITFA conference.
You forgot to take a step back at the right time.
Applied by his Director of Finance to do that, but again, he'll be talking about some of the challenges that we're facing going forward. And again, it's something that going forward is going to become ever more important. And I think it's really important that as public finance accountants and as SITFA members, that we've got a key role to play in supporting that transition to net zero. It probably is the biggest issue facing us. It doesn't feel that maybe when we're looking at our budget position, but actually for our children, our grandchildren's future, it's important that is a top priority.
Completely agree. And I think that as accountants, it is a bit about CITFA are working at the moment with various partners on this. It's a bit about what will that reporting look like in the years to come, and it is at a stage where it's only being developed. There are international consultations on new accounting standards and so on in this area, but it will become, as you say, Martin, one of the key metrics by which the public sector will be judged in the years to come. But following on from your point about the grants with the lead pipes, one of the things I also have lived in Glasgow for quite a lot of the last few years, and I remember a big exercise where European funds were used to add insulation to the housing stock and new roofs and things like that. Now we're in a post-Brexit world, and the implications of Brexit still aren't fully understood. Lots of councils and other organisations in the past have used that funding to take forward these kind of regeneration projects. The UK government have introduced the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and we've also heard a lot about levelling up, and there are various levelling up pots of money to bid for, that councils can kind of bid for. What's that meant for the public sector in Scotland? I mean, how have you dealt with that? Is it almost like a like-for-like replacement, or does it still remain to be seen? I think there's some funds till 2024 from the EU, but it's coming.
Yeah, certainly as the European funds finish off, there is the hope of future funding. I think probably at this precise moment in time, there's still, I think the devil is in the detail. It might be an appropriate statement to make. We probably don't know enough. We've had some information about the Shared Prosperity Fund, which everyone started calling SPF, which is really confusing for me because that's Strathclyde Pension Fund. But we'll manage through that small technical difficulty. We really need to see what the future of that funding is, what the flexibilities will be. It certainly looks at first look as if it will be, we'll say, slightly less bureaucratic than the European funding, which did come with quite a lot of its own challenges. Certainly, I think we're fortunate in Scotland. The Scottish Office team that have been created, headed up by Lauren Bruce, who understands local government and understands local government finance through her previous role with COSLA, is really helpful. But we'll find as that develops, certainly there's some good initial things, but again, about how long term that funding is going to be, how open is it to kind of what happens politically down south, and also the Levelling Up Fund, which again is kind of like capital bids. Again, Glasgow was successful with a phase 1 bid. We've submitted a number. We're allowed one for every constituency. We've got 7 constituencies, parliamentary constituencies within Glasgow. So we've submitted 6 other bids. There's not a lot of clarity about when or if stage 3 bids will come. So we're just really waiting to see what happens there. But any funding's helpful, but the more flexibility we have over funding, the better. So I'm very conscious of time.
No, yeah, no, I was just going to say, I know from, in CITFA we speak to a lot of stakeholders across the country, and one of the things we do hear about the Levelling Up funding is just the resource intensive nature of applying for specific pots of money, and it can mean in smaller organisations where they don't have the resources, they're less able to bid for that. So it just means that you have to, some of the skill is in being able to craft a very strong bid rather than actually evidencing your requirement to get it. But I do know that at our CITFA conference back in July, Jeremy Pocklington did talk about the fact that they might be moving away from that a bit more moving forward to try and make it easier to access. But at the CITFA conference in a few weeks, we're going to have Lauren Bruce that you mentioned before and Jeff Matsu, CITFA's chief economist, talking on this subject a bit more and about some of the lessons around levelling up from across the world. Actually, Jeff's done a case study with 4 cities from around the world in terms of how they've achieved outcomes from levelling up. But that's been really helpful, Martin, and obviously we want to take some time to give people an opportunity for questions. I can see that nobody's put any questions in the Q&A panel so far. This is your chance to ask Martin anything you like on any subject, whether it's related to our conference or not.
Within reason.
Yeah. Oh, no. Yeah. How will I benefit? Well, I think the thing that I would say, so somebody saying, how will I benefit from attending the conference? I'm attending the conference this year as a SITFA employee, the head of policy and technical, but I've been to it a few times in the past, having been a public sector officer when I worked for Police Scotland and when I worked for Glasgow City Council a few years ago as well. And I think as well as the opportunity to hear more about the subjects that we've talked about, it's the fact that you get to actually network with your colleagues from across the sector. You get that chance to kind of take a day or two out of the office and hear about what other people are doing, understand best practice, and actually think. It's really great to be able to come to webinars like this where you can just kind of log on, but it can be quite tricky to have that time to ignore the inbox as it pings as you sit there. So I do think taking the time to hear about what other people are doing and remind ourselves that as public sector finance professionals, we really are in a great position to impact on these issues, much more so than many other people. Martin,
just to add to that, Kirsty, we've all been kind of on teams or working in quite an isolated position for the last couple of years. So actually the ability to get together for our mental health, I think, is really important. But also, I think we're in a very fortunate position in Scotland, that Scotland's small enough that actually you can kind of get to know everybody within the sector. There is really strong relationships that can be built up. So actually, meeting people and getting to know them and building those relationships, I think is really, really important for all of us at all stages of our career to build those relationships, because actually we do rely on each other really heavily, particularly in the challenging times we're in. And that no matter what problem is, there's somebody you can talk to in another authority that's maybe going through that problem. So it really, really important, I think, from that point of view.
No, that's a really great point. And actually, the slide's up on the screen at the moment, but for people who've attended the webinar today, we're giving a discount on the cost of attending the conference. So you can kind of follow you'll get an email sent to you after this webinar with the details of how you can make use of that discount. But I really would say that it's a great opportunity and it would be really worth your time to make the trip to the conference. So we've had another question here from Ian Lorimer. So Martin, is inflation or the National Care Service the bigger threat to local government financial sustainability?
Yeah, not wanting to quote from Donald Rumsfeld, but I suppose inflation's a known at the moment. I think the National Care Service is somewhere between an unknown and a known unknown, probably a known unknown mostly. I have to admit I was really disappointed at the lack of detail in the bill, at the fairly generic assumptions that they've made for such a fundamental change in the structure of public services. So that there's so many unknowns. We don't know what they think the structure will be. Is there going to be one care board? Is there going to be 32 care boards? I think the answer is probably somewhere between those two, that it won't be one and it won't be 32. But how many will it be? What services will be included? What impact will that have on the services that are left behind? What is that budget going to be? What's that bureaucracy going to be? There's just so many. What's going to be the VAT position of that? What's going to happen with pension funds, with asset transfers? There is so many unknown questions. So thanks for that question, Ian. That's probably almost impossible to answer. They are both significant challenges for us, but obviously inflation is live with us just now. We can probably wait till next week, but probably not much longer than next week to deal with the National Care Service.
Yeah, it's something that seems to be getting wrestled with across the whole of the UK. The integration of health and social care was obviously legislated for in Scotland quite a few years ago now, and this is the sort of next iteration that Scottish Government are considering in this area. Whereas in England at the moment, they're starting their kind of legislative integration journey right now with the creation of integrated care boards. And I suppose one of the things that my team and I try to do in SITFA when we work with stakeholders in England is just remind them that actually a lot of this has already been tried out in Scotland, and there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from the experiences so far.
There's another question popped in, Kirsty, from Brian, which is about can we afford to still have 32 local authorities? Wow. I think it's something that probably the number of challenges we've got at the moment is not going to be in the agenda right just now. There was also a letter came out from Scottish Government recently saying that they weren't looking at local authority boundaries. That letter came out quite recently, so they're certainly not looking at it at the moment. But I think, and this probably I have to state this as a personal view, it's not the view of Glasgow City Council or the view of SITFA, either from Scotland or nationally, but to me, as we look at this transformation piece about how we deal with public sector services going forward, I think it's something that has to be looked at. It has to be looked at from a basis of, is there benefits to having single boundaries across public services? At the moment, we've got some things that are delivered nationally, police, fire. We've got some things that are delivered on the kind of health board structure, with 14 boards, and then local authorities 32 boards. We've then got joint boards for some of those services. So there is a bit of a hodgepodge of structures at the moment. So certainly I think it's something that in the medium term needs to be looked at. But I'll stress again, that's a personal view and not the view of any organisations.
Very diplomatic, Martin. And I was just going to add again, looking south of the border, local government reorganisation is something that's been looked at in England in particular. They have an even more complicated landscape when it comes to local government than Scotland do, and they've started to create these unitary authorities out of smaller authorities. So they obviously have the appetite down there. But obviously we operate in a completely different political environment in Scotland, so that has to be borne in mind. I think we've got 1 minute. Oh, here we go. One last question. Ian McKee, any thoughts on where the procurement service focus needs to lie in terms of the budget pressure? I think that might be Ian McKee, the procurement lead from Police Scotland.
Do you know, again, really good question, Ian, and probably not one where I'm a specialist. I think we all get frustrated sometimes at procurement, but we need procurement to drive efficiencies, to drive savings, but we also need procurement to be supporting our economies, to make sure that procurement's fair, that we're supporting local businesses wherever we can. I always think that our budgetary position would be much better if we just thought of the council, but we don't just think about the council, and I know this is common throughout the country. We think about our areas. So we think about what's best for Glasgow rather than what's best for the city. So it might be best for Glasgow for us to buy all of our widgets from overseas at the lowest possible price, but actually that's just taking jobs away from Glasgow or from Scotland. So that balance of being able to support the local economy, so therefore people can pay non-domestic rates, they can pay council tax, they can shop in our shops, they can eat in our restaurants, and that supporting the wider economy is really important. So hence the need for that that ability to be able to source locally is really important. But I also think that we're slightly tied by some of the bureaucracy around procurement, and if we can simplify procurement so that it's seen to be fair, but it's as efficient as possible, and that we can actually react to situations. Yeah, tough question for a non-procurement specialist, but hopefully that's answered. Yeah.
And again, something which we could look forward to discussing more over a glass of wine or a pint of beer at the conference in a few weeks. So that's all our time today, and thank you, Martin, so much for that. It was a really interesting discussion, and hopefully people that were attending got some interesting insight and piqued your appetite for coming along in a few weeks' time. As I said, we'll send an email to all of the attendees after this with your discount on the delegate price for the conference. But until then, we'll say goodbye now. Thank you again, Martin, and thank you to all of you. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.